The desert sun burned everything it touched until even the rocks begged for shade. She stumbled barefoot across the burning sand, each breath tearing through her chest like wildfire. Dust clung to her dark hair, and blood streaked her legs where the thorns had torn her skin. Behind her, the thunder of hooves grew closer with every heartbeat. A rifle shot cracked the silence, and a broken cry escaped her throat. She couldn't look back. She wouldn't. Her name was Isabella Martinez, and for 3 days she'd been running from men who wore badges but carried no honor. The world spun as she tripped over sun-bleached bones, her knees hitting the scorched earth, palms shredding on sharp stones. Every breath tasted of copper and fear. Every step felt stolen from death itself. Through the heat shimmer, she saw salvation. A ranch house, weathered wood fences, a broken table beside an old barn. No people, no soldiers, just blessed silence and the drone of desert flies. She crawled forward on hands and knees, dragging herself through the dust like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Her vision blurred, lips cracked like dried leather. She could hear her stomach crying louder than her voice. When she finally reached the shade of that broken table, her body surrendered completely. She tried to lift herself again, but strength had abandoned her. Her fingers found a splintered edge of wood and held on like it was the last solid thing in her world. For a moment, she thought maybe dying here would be quieter than running forever. That's when she heard the boots. Slow steps, measured, not chasing or shouting. Just coming closer. Her eyes lifted and saw a man standing a few feet away. Broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, a face carved by years and desert wind. In his weathered hand, an axe, still damp from work. He didn't look like a soldier, but he looked dangerous in a different way. The kind of man who'd buried more than one secret out here in the vastness. He took one careful step forward. She tried to crawl back, but her body refused to obey. Her pulse thundered in her ears as he slowly knelt and reached a hand toward her shoulder. The fear broke loose from her chest like a trapped bird. Her voice came out cracked, half whisper, half desperate plea. "Be gentle. It's too fast." The words hung in the scorching air between them, trembling with vulnerability and terror. The man froze, his calloused hand suspended above her torn shoulder. His weathered eyes searched her face as if trying to understand what kind of wounds could make a person fear even kindness itself. The wind carried the smell of sweat, dust, and something unmistakably human. Pity, maybe, or perhaps regret from his own forgotten past. He slowly lowered his hand and spoke with a voice roughened by solitude and desert living. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. She flinched anyway, as if each gentle word was another kind of touch she wasn't ready for. He stood again, walked deliberately to the barn, and returned with a dented canteen. He set it carefully on the ground beside her, then turned his back and walked away. No questions, no demands, no threats. Only respectful distance. Isabella stared at the water until her reflection wavered in the metal surface. Could she trust a stranger who didn't ask where she'd come from, who didn't demand anything in return? The desert had never given her anything without taking twice as much back. But here was mercy, offered freely and without conditions. Her trembling fingers reached for the canteen, the metal warm from the desert sun but feeling like salvation itself. The first sip burned her cracked lips, but the water that followed was the sweetest thing she'd tasted in days. From somewhere behind the barn came the soft whinny of a horse and the creak of wooden gates. The man was still there, working quietly, maybe watching over her, maybe just giving her the space to decide whether to trust him. She didn't know which frightened her more. Her voice cracked again, softer now, almost swallowed by the desert wind. "Who are you? And why didn't you just walk away when you saw me?" From the shadows near the barn, his voice carried back, rough as sandpaper, but somehow gentle. "Name's Samuel Westbrook, and I didn't walk away because I remember what it's like to need a place to stop running." When Isabella opened her eyes again, the sun had moved lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. The barn smelled of hay and honest work. For the first time in days, no one was chasing her, but peace felt like another kind of trap. Her body had betrayed her into this vulnerability, and vulnerability had always been dangerous. She sat up quickly, every muscle screaming in protest. The canteen still lay beside her, nearly empty now. He hadn't taken it back. Through the open barn door, she could see Samuel near the fence, mending rope with the kind of steady patience that spoke of a man who'd stopped rushing through life long ago. He noticed her watching and gave a small nod. Nothing more. No smile that might be false, no threat that might be real. Just that quiet acknowledgement that confused her more than fear ever had. Her stomach growled so loudly it made the barn cat look up from its nap. She couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry at her body's betrayal. She chose neither. Samuel walked back to the barn, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. He handed her a piece of cornbread wrapped in clean cloth and a tin cup filled with something that smelled like heaven. "Eat," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd known hunger himself. She hesitated, her fingers trembling before accepting the offering. The bread tasted real, not like the stale hardtack she'd stolen from abandoned campsites, but like something meant for living people, baked by hands that cared about nourishment. After a few careful bites, she whispered without looking up, "You could have turned me in for the bounty." Samuel wiped his hands on his work shirt, leaving streaks of honest dirt. "Could have," he agreed simply. "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." She frowned, trying to understand this man who spoke in simple truths. "Why not?" He looked at her for a long time before answering, his weathered face thoughtful in the golden light. "Because you didn't come here asking for help. You just needed a place to stop running. There's a difference." The words settled between them like dust after a windstorm, heavy with meaning she wasn't ready to explore. No one spoke for a while. Outside, the wind pushed tumbleweeds against the barn walls with sounds like whispered secrets. She finally stood up, still unsteady on her feet. Her eyes darted to the open door, to the vast desert that stretched beyond like an ocean of possibility and threat. Freedom or fear, they felt like the same thing most days. She took 2 hesitant steps toward the door, then froze. Her gaze had landed on something that made her blood run cold. A rifle hanging on the barn wall. Old but well-maintained. Loaded, maybe. Her pulse quickened as old terrors rose like smoke in her chest. Was this kindness real, or was it another kind of trap dressed up in gentle manners? Samuel noticed her stare, followed her eyes to the weapon. "You can take it if you want," he said quietly, no change in his tone. "Shoot me if it makes you feel safer." She blinked, uncertain if he was serious. Nobody had ever given her that kind of choice before. The power to defend herself, offered freely by the very person who might threaten her. Her throat tightened, and she turned away from the rifle. "I don't want to shoot anyone," she murmured, the words feeling strange in her mouth. When had she last said something so honest? He shrugged, as if armed women in his barn were nothing unusual. "Then don't." That night, Isabella lay awake on the hay Samuel had spread for her. Through the cracks in the weathered walls, she could see the moon, silver and distant, like something watching over both of them. Every time the wind rattled the barn door, she jumped, waiting for footsteps, for shouted orders, for the past to find her again. But all she heard was the slow, steady rhythm of a man breathing on the porch outside. Samuel stayed there all night, just sitting, just listening to the desert breathe. Not guarding her like a prisoner, but watching over her like someone who understood that safety was something you built one quiet moment at a time. By morning, questions burned in her chest stronger than hunger. Who was this man who could be so calm with a dangerous stranger sleeping in his barn? What was he really hiding behind those patient eyes? And why did his gentleness feel more terrifying than any threat she'd ever faced? Because kindness, Isabella had learned, always came with a price. The question was what Samuel Westbrook would ask for when he decided to collect. The morning came slow and peaceful, the kind of desert dawn that painted the world in shades of hope. The land stretched wide and golden, looking gentle from a distance, but harsh as truth when you stood in it. Samuel poured coffee into a dented tin cup and set it beside the barn door where Isabella could find it. She was already awake, sitting near the wall with her knees drawn up, eyes still carrying the shadows of sleepless vigilance. "Coffee," he said simply, the single word somehow conveying more warmth than 1,000 empty reassurances. She looked at the steam curling up from the cup and whispered, Thank you." Her voice still carried that careful quality of someone who'd learned to whisper even when no one was listening. When she stepped outside, the morning sunlight hit her face, and for just a moment, she forgot she was supposed to be afraid. A small smile almost appeared at the corners of her mouth, but then she saw them. Three men on horseback, sitting their mounts near the property line, watching. Not soldiers this time, but townspeople. The kind who loved other people's trouble more than they loved peace. The kind who saw a foreign woman and immediately assumed the worst. One of them spat into the dust and called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Guess old Sam likes his company young and foreign these days." Samuel's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he didn't answer. He just stared at them with the kind of steady gaze that made cowards uncomfortable, until they turned their horses and rode away. But the hatred they left behind hung in the air heavier than dust. Isabella clenched her fists at her sides. "They hate me." Samuel took a slow sip of his coffee, considering his words. "They hate what they don't understand. Fear makes people cruel." She let out a bitter laugh that held no humor. "Then they must hate a lot of things in this world." Samuel almost smiled at that, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who'd learned hard truths about human nature. The peace lasted until noon, when Sheriff Blake arrived like a cloud blocking the sun. His boots were too clean for honest work, his badge too bright for someone who'd seen real justice. He leaned against the doorframe with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. "Heard you got yourself a guest, Sam," the sheriff said, his eyes sliding toward Isabella like a snake tasting the air. "A pretty one, too." Samuel didn't answer, just stood there with the kind of stillness that spoke louder than words. The sheriff's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "You know the law says she can't be here. Vagrant, probably a criminal. Could be dangerous." Samuel looked straight at him, his voice steady as bedrock. "I know the law also says a man's home is his own. And I know the difference between justice and persecution." The tension thickened like summer heat, making the very air hard to breathe. Finally, the sheriff smirked and tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "You always did like testing limits, Sam. Don't let this one ruin you." After he rode away, the silence that followed felt louder than gunfire. Isabella and Samuel stood in the aftermath of veiled threats and barely contained violence, both understanding that this was only the beginning. That evening, Isabella sat on the porch steps watching the horizon swallow the sun in a blaze of crimson and gold. The desert was beautiful when it wasn't trying to kill you, she thought, almost beautiful enough to make you forget the dangers hiding in its vastness. She spoke without turning around, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. "They won't stop, will they?" Samuel's answer came softly from behind her, filled with the certainty of a man who'd seen this story before. "No. But neither will you." Her lips curved into the smallest smile she'd worn in years. For the first time since she'd started running, she believed it might be true. Somewhere in that quiet moment, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, something changed between them. Not love yet. That would take time and trust and 100 small kindnesses. But the beginning of something that might survive the desert, the law, and the hatred of small-minded people. Something that might even survive the truth about who Isabella really was and why those men had been chasing her across 3 territories. Night dropped fast that day, heavy and dry like a blanket made of dust. The air smelled like rain that would never come. Samuel sat by the small fire he'd built outside the barn, sharpening a knife with the kind of deliberate care that spoke of old habits and older memories. The blade caught the firelight, throwing small sparks of reflected flame into the darkness. Isabella was inside the barn, trying to mend a torn sleeve by lamplight. The flame trembled every time the wind pushed through the gaps in the weathered wood, making her shadow dance on the walls like a restless spirit. She'd found needle and thread in Samuel's supplies. Good thread, the kind that didn't break when you needed it most. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse whinnied nervously, then another answered. Then came the sound that made Samuel's head lift. Boots on gravel, moving with the kind of confidence that usually meant trouble. 3 men emerged from the darkness, maybe 4, too light-footed for honest farmers, too sure of themselves for simple travelers. Samuel could read men's intentions in the way they walked, and these men walked like predators who'd caught a scent. The barn door creaked as one of them pushed it open, his voice slurring through the night air with whiskey and malice. "Well now, look what the old man's been hiding." It was Jake Morrison, one of the men from the fence earlier, drunk on cheap liquor and cheaper courage. The others laughed behind him, their voices carrying the ugly sound of men who enjoyed other people's fear. Samuel stood slowly, the knife still in his weathered hand. "I told you boys to stay off my land." They stepped closer, boots crunching on the dry earth with deliberate menace. Morrison's eyes were red-rimmed and wild, fixed on the barn where Isabella was hidden. "You don't own the girl, Samuel," Morrison slurred, swaying slightly. "Word is, she's worth good money to the right people." Real good money. Before Samuel could answer, Isabella appeared in the barn doorway, holding the old rifle she'd seen on the wall. Her hands shook, but her dark eyes were steady as mountain stone. The lamplight behind her made her hair shine like polished copper. "I'm not for sale," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the desert air like a blade cutting silk. Morrison grinned, showing teeth stained with tobacco and poor decisions. "Sweetheart, you don't even belong in this territory. You're just cargo that walked away from where it was supposed to be." He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers thick and grasping. Isabella didn't hesitate. The rifle butt slammed into his face with a sound like breaking wood. Blood spurted from his nose and he stumbled backward, cursing in words that would make a saloon girl blush. The others charged forward, thinking they could overwhelm an old man and a scared woman. They learned different. Samuel moved like a man half his age, all the accumulated violence of his past flowing through him like water through a broken dam. His first punch caught the nearest man in the jaw, spinning him around. Pain shot through Samuel's knuckles, but he kept moving, driven by something deeper than anger. The need to protect someone who'd asked for nothing but a place to rest. Isabella screamed and fired a warning shot into the air, the sound splitting the night like thunder. The muzzle flash lit up the entire yard, showing the scattered men clearly for one brief, violent moment. The horses panicked and bolted, their hooves drumming against the earth as they fled into the darkness. The men backed off, dragging their wounded friend between them and muttering threats that carried on the wind like smoke. They left only because the gunshot would draw attention from town, and they weren't ready for that kind of scrutiny. Silence fell again, broken only by Samuel's rough breathing. He leaned against the fence post, blood trickling from a cut on his temple, dust in his graying hair. His chest rose and fell with the effort of fighting men 40 years younger than himself. Isabella dropped the rifle and ran to him, her earlier fear forgotten in the face of his injury. "Why did you fight for me?" she whispered, her hands hovering over his wounds, afraid to touch but desperate to help. He looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "Because I'm tired of watching good people get hurt for no reason other than fear and greed." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain that might never come and gunpowder that would linger until morning. They stood there in the flickering light of the dying fire, two people who had nothing left to lose but each other, discovering that sometimes that's enough. "They'll be back," Isabella said, stating the obvious truth they both knew. "Probably," Samuel agreed, touching the cut on his head and wincing. "But next time we'll be ready." She helped him clean the wound with water from the well, her touch gentle despite the trembling in her fingers. In the lamplight, she could see old scars on his hands and arms, the kind that came from a lifetime of hard living and harder choices. "You've done this before," she observed quietly. "Fought for people. Once or twice." His voice carried weight that spoke of stories he wasn't ready to tell. "Long time ago, in a different life." What happened to that life? Samuel was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then as she bandaged his cut with strips torn from her own clothes, he spoke. "I had a family once. Wife, daughter. Lost them both to men not much different from the ones who were here tonight. Men who thought they could take what they wanted because they had guns and badges and the law on their side." Isabella's hand stilled. "I'm sorry." "So am I. But sorry doesn't bring back the dead, and it doesn't stop the next group of predators from hurting the next innocent person." He met her eyes, his gaze steady. "Sometimes a man has to make a choice about what kind of person he wants to be when the world goes dark." She finished the bandage and sat back on her heels, studying this man who'd risked everything for a stranger. And what kind of person did you choose to be? The kind who doesn't walk away when someone needs help, even if it costs me everything I have left. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. In the distance, a coyote howled, wild and free and unafraid of the darkness. Isabella listened to the sound and felt something shift inside her chest. "Samuel," she said softly, "there's something you should know about me. About why those men are really chasing me." He waited, patient as the desert itself. "I'm not just some vagrant they want to move along. I took something. Something they want back very badly." "What kind of something?" Isabella reached into the pocket of her torn dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a piece of paper, folded and worn from handling. When she unfolded it, Samuel could see it was covered in official-looking writing and numbers. "It's a mining claim," she said quietly. "Legal documentation that proves my father owned a silver mine before the territorial government decided he was too Mexican to keep it. They killed him for this paper, but I got away with it." Samuel studied the document in the firelight, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "And now they want to make sure this claim never sees the inside of a courthouse. They've been chasing me across 3 territories trying to get it back. Or kill me, whichever comes first." The implications settled between them like dust after a windstorm. This wasn't just about prejudice or vagrant laws. This was about theft on a massive scale, sanctioned by corrupt officials who thought they could steal a man's life's work and murder anyone who objected. "Isabella," Samuel said carefully, "do you understand what this means? If we can get this to the right people, prove your father's legal claim, it means a lot of powerful men are going to want us dead." She folded the paper carefully and tucked it away. "It means anyone who helps me becomes a target." Samuel looked at her, this brave young woman who'd carried justice in her pocket while running for her life across the desert. Then he looked at his ranch, his peaceful existence, everything he'd built in his years of solitude. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything, "I suppose it's a good thing I'm tired of being peaceful." But as they sat by the dying fire, planning their next move, neither of them noticed the shadow watching from the ridge above the ranch. Someone had seen the fight, heard their conversation, and was already riding hard toward town with news that would bring down a storm of violence they couldn't imagine. The past was about to catch up with both of them, and this time, there would be nowhere left to run. Morning rose slow and ominous, the kind of desert dawn that painted the world in shades of warning. The air felt heavy, charged with the electricity that comes before lightning strikes. Samuel stood by the well, pumping water into a bucket, while his eyes scanned the horizon with the restless attention of a man who'd learned to read danger in the landscape. Isabella emerged from the barn carrying her few possessions in a cloth bundle. Her dark hair was braided back severely, and she'd torn strips from her dress to bind her wounded hands. She looked like a woman preparing for war, which Samuel supposed she was. "How far to the territorial courthouse?" she asked, settling the leather pouch containing her father's mining claim closer to her heart. 3 days hard riding to Santa Fe," Samuel replied, not taking his eyes off the ridge where he'd seen movement just before dawn. "But we're not going to make it that far." Isabella followed his gaze and saw them too. Riders silhouetted against the morning sky like harbingers of judgment. Too many to count from this distance, but enough to make the breath catch in her throat. "They found us," she whispered. "They found us," Samuel confirmed grimly. He turned to face her, his weathered hands steady despite the storm approaching. "Isabella, I need you to listen carefully. There's a cave system about 2 miles north of here, hidden in the rocks where Willow Creek bends. You can follow the water underground for about a mile before it surfaces near the old Spanish mission. You're talking like you're not coming with me." Samuel's smile held no humor, only the quiet acceptance of a man who'd made his peace with hard choices. "Someone needs to slow them down, give you time to reach people who can help. That mining claim is the only justice your father's going to get." Isabella stepped closer, her dark eyes blazing with something fiercer than fear. "I didn't ask you to die for me, Samuel Westbrook. No, you didn't. But I'm asking you to live for both of us." Before she could argue further, The sound of approaching horses grew loud enough to rattle the barn doors. Samuel counted them as they descended from the ridge. 12 riders, maybe more, led by a man in an expensive coat who sat his horse like he owned the world and everything in it. "That's Garrett Morrison," Samuel said quietly, recognizing the man at the head of the approaching storm. "Jake's older brother, and the one with connections to the territorial government. If he's here personally, it means they're not planning to leave witnesses." The riders spread out in a wide circle around the ranch, cutting off every avenue of escape. Garrett Morrison dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His coat was tailored, his boots polished, and his smile held all the warmth of a winter grave. "Samuel Westbrook," Garrett called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "I hear you've been harboring a dangerous fugitive." "That's not like you, Sam. You've always been such a law-abiding man." Samuel stepped into the yard, his hands loose at his sides but ready for anything. "Funny thing about the law, Garrett. Sometimes what's legal and what's right are two different things entirely." Garrett's laugh was cultured, practiced, the kind wealthy men use to show their superiority. "Philosophy from a broken-down rancher. How quaint. Where's the girl, Sam?" "What girl?" "The Mexican thief who stole government documents. The one you've been hiding like some lovesick fool." Garrett's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Oh yes, we know all about your little romance. My men saw everything last night. The fight, the confession, that touching moment by the fire." Isabella stepped out of the barn before Samuel could stop her, the leather pouch visible in her hand like a declaration of war. "I'm right here, you murdering bastard." The words hit the morning air like a slap. Several of Garrett's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. But Garrett himself just smiled wider, as if Isabella's defiance was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "Isabella Martinez," he said, savoring her name like expensive wine. "Daughter of the late Pedro Martinez, who died so tragically in that mining accident. Such a shame how these accidents happen to people who don't understand their place." "My father was murdered for a legal mining claim," Isabella shot back, her voice carrying across the desert like a battle cry. "And you ordered it." "Prove it," Garrett said simply. "Oh wait, you can't. Because dead men tell no tales, and stolen documents aren't admissible in any court that matters." He gestured to his men, and they began to close the circle, rifles emerging from saddle scabbards like metal teeth. "Now you're going to hand over that paper, and then you're going to disappear. Permanently. As for Sam here, well, he should have minded his own business." That's when Samuel made his move. The knife he'd been sharpening by the fire was in his hand faster than thought, flying across the yard to bury itself in the shoulder of the nearest gunman. The man screamed and toppled from his horse, blood spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. "Run!" Samuel shouted to Isabella, drawing his own rifle as chaos erupted around them. "Run now!" Isabella didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the rocks where Willow Creek disappeared underground. The leather pouch clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, gunfire erupted like thunder, and she heard Samuel's rifle answering with the steady rhythm of a man who'd learned to shoot when it mattered. The cave opening was hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines, barely visible even when you knew where to look. Isabella plunged into the darkness, the sound of battle fading behind her like a terrible dream. The underground stream was ice cold against her legs as she waded deeper into the mountain's heart, following the current toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. Behind her, Samuel stood alone in his ranch yard, surrounded by armed men who wanted him dead. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Because sometimes a man had to choose between safety and what was right, and Samuel Westbrook had finally chosen. The cave swallowed Isabella like the earth itself was protecting her. Water rushed around her ankles, and the darkness ahead seemed infinite. But she kept moving because somewhere in that black tunnel was the light of justice, and her father's memory deserved nothing less. Above ground, the battle for Samuel's ranch, in Isabella's life, was just beginning. Gunfire echoed across the desert like thunder, and somewhere in that violence, the fate of two unlikely allies would be decided by courage, desperation, and the kind of love that grows in the harshest soil. Samuel's ranch burned as the sun climbed higher, but Isabella Martinez carried her father's truth deeper into the earth, toward whatever waited in the light beyond the darkness. Because sometimes when the world tries to bury you, the only choice is to go deeper and find the strength to dig your way back to the surface. The storm had arrived, but it hadn't won yet. Not while there was still breath in their bodies and truth in their hearts. The real fight was just beginning, and in the underground waters of Willow Creek, justice flowed like a river that could not be stopped, no matter how many men tried to dam it with violence and corruption. Isabella pressed forward through the darkness, carrying hope and truth and the memory of a gentle rancher who taught her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be kind to a stranger. Behind her, Samuel's rifle spoke its own language of defiance, and ahead of her, the light of justice waited like a promise that even the deepest darkness could not break. In that moment, between gunfire and flowing water, between past and future, between despair and hope, two souls found the courage to fight for something bigger than themselves. And that, perhaps, was the real miracle of the American frontier, not the violence or the conquest, but the moments when ordinary people chose to be extraordinary, one act of courage at a time. The cave swallowed Isabella whole, darkness wrapping around her like a living thing with teeth. The underground stream rushed past her legs, ice cold and relentless, carrying the taste of minerals and ancient secrets. Behind her, the gunfire had become a distant thunder, muffled by tons of rock and the weight of her own desperation. She stumbled forward through the black water, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall, the other clutching the leather pouch that contained her father's legacy. Each step was a gamble. The creek bed was treacherous with loose stones and sudden drops, and in the absolute darkness, she had only sound and touch to guide her. The water rose to her waist as the tunnel narrowed, forcing her to half swim, half wade through the rushing current. Her dress, already torn and travel-stained, became a sodden weight that threatened to drag her under. But she pressed on because behind her lay death and corruption, and ahead lay the only hope of justice her father would ever receive. How long she traveled through that underground world, she couldn't say. Time moved differently in the Earth's heart, measured not in minutes but in heartbeats, in the rhythm of flowing water, in the burning ache of muscles pushed beyond their limits. The leather pouch grew heavy as a stone against her chest, but she never loosened her grip on it. Then gradually, the absolute darkness began to soften. Not light exactly, but a lessening of the black that pressed against her eyes like velvet. The tunnel began to widen, and she could hear something different in the water's song, the echo of open space ahead. Isabella emerged from the cave like a spirit rising from the underworld, blinking against sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the journey through stone. The old Spanish mission, as Samuel had mentioned, stood before her, its adobe walls weathered by centuries of wind and sun, its bell tower reaching toward a sky that promised either salvation or damnation. But it wasn't empty. A woman knelt in the mission's small garden, tending to plants that somehow flourished in the desert soil. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back and hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. When she looked up and saw Isabella standing dripping in the mission doorway, her face showed no surprise, only the calm acceptance of someone who'd learned to expect miracles and tragedies in equal measure. "Child," the woman said softly, rising from her garden with the fluid grace of someone who'd never forgotten how to move with purpose. "You look like you've been traveling through hell itself." Isabella's knees finally gave out, exhaustion and relief combining to drop her onto the mission's stone steps. The leather pouch fell from her nerveless fingers, and she stared at it as if surprised to find she'd carried it this far. "Not hell," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the underground journey. "Just truth, which might be the same thing." The woman, Sister Maria, she introduced herself, helped Isabella inside the mission's cool interior. The walls were thick adobe, painted white and decorated with simple wooden crosses that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through narrow windows. It smelled of candle wax and desert sage, of prayers offered in a dozen languages over the course of centuries. Sister Maria brought water in a clay pitcher, bread that was still warm from the oven, and clothes that would fit Isabella's slight frame. While Isabella cleaned the cave water from her skin and changed into the simple brown dress, Sister Maria examined the mining claim with the careful attention of someone who understood that pieces of paper could change the world. Your father was Pedro Martinez, Sister Maria said, not asking but stating a fact she'd somehow already known. Isabella nodded, braiding her damp hair back from her face. You knew him. I knew of him. A good man by all accounts. Worked his claim honestly, treated his workers fairly, never forgot where he came from. Sister Maria folded the document carefully and handed it back. There are not many such men in this territory. They killed him for being one of them, and now they want to kill you for carrying proof of his innocence. Sister Maria moved to the window, her eyes scanning the desert beyond. How many men were chasing you, child? Too many. And they have connections to the territorial government, money, influence, everything my father never had. Isabella felt despair settling into her bones like winter cold. Maybe I should just burn this paper and disappear. It's not worth more deaths. Sister Maria turned from the window, her weathered face stern with the kind of authority that came from speaking truth to power for 6 decades. Pedro Martinez died believing that justice existed in this world. Are you going to make his sacrifice meaningless by giving up now? Before Isabella could answer, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the mission walls. Sister Maria's expression didn't change, but her hand moved to a rifle that hung behind the simple wooden altar. How many? Isabella whispered, moving to peer through the narrow window. 8 riders, Sister Maria said calmly, checking the rifle's load with practiced efficiency, including that snake Garrett Morrison. Isabella's blood turned to ice. They followed me through the caves. No, child. They simply know this territory better than you do. There are only so many places to run in this desert, and men like Morrison have been hunting people across it for longer than you've been alive. The riders spread out in a loose circle around the mission, their weapons visible and their intentions clear. But they didn't charge immediately. Instead, Garrett Morrison dismounted and approached the heavy wooden door with the confident stride of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. Sister Maria, he called out, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a politician addressing voters. I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to the territorial government. Sister Maria opened the door but didn't step aside to let him enter. The only thing in this mission that belongs to anyone is the peace of God, Garrett Morrison, and you've never shown much interest in that. Morrison's smile was all teeth and no warmth. I'm here for the Martinez girl and the stolen documents she's carrying. Hand them over, and no one needs to get hurt. Stolen from whom? Sister Maria's voice carried the steel of someone who'd faced down corrupt officials before. From the men who murdered her father? From the government that seized his legal claim without compensation? Exactly who is the thief in this situation? Morrison's facade slipped, revealing the ugly truth beneath his polished exterior. The girl is a criminal and a vagrant. The document is a forgery, and you, sister, are harboring a fugitive from justice. I'm harboring a young woman seeking the justice that men like you have denied her family. Sister Maria stepped forward, forcing Morrison to back up or appear to be threatening a nun. And if you think you can intimidate the church with your guns and your corruption, you've forgotten what happened to the last man who tried. Isabella watched this confrontation through the window, amazed by the older woman's courage. But she also saw Morrison's men positioning themselves for a siege, and she knew that bravery alone wouldn't stop bullets. Sister, she called softly, there's a back door to this mission, isn't there? Sister Maria glanced over her shoulder, understanding immediately. The sacristy door leads to the old cemetery. From there, you can reach the arroyo that runs north toward the territorial capital. How far? 2 days on foot, less if you can find a horse. Isabella looked at the mining claim in her hands, feeling the weight of her father's dreams and her own impossible choices. Stay and fight with a woman who'd shown her kindness, or run again and hope that justice could outrun corruption. Go, Sister Maria said firmly, still facing down Morrison through the doorway. This old woman has been dealing with men like him since before you were born. But that document needs to reach people who still believe in law over profit. Morrison's patience was wearing thin. Sister, I'm going to count to 10. Then my men are coming in whether you cooperate or not. Count away, Sister Maria replied calmly. I'll be saying my prayers. Isabella slipped through the sacristy door into the mission's small cemetery, where weathered headstones marked the graves of Spanish colonists, Mexican settlers, and American pioneers who'd found peace together in death that they'd never known in life. The irony wasn't lost on her as she made her way between the graves toward the arroyo beyond. Behind her, she heard Morrison beginning his count, his voice growing uglier with each number. She also heard Sister Maria's voice, strong and clear, reciting the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. It was a sound that carried hope and defiance in equal measure, and Isabella carried it with her as she ran toward whatever waited in the desert beyond. But as she reached the edge of the cemetery, a figure stepped out from behind a weathered mausoleum. A man in a dusty coat with a sheriff's badge that caught the afternoon sun like a warning. "Going somewhere, Miss Martinez?" Sheriff Blake asked, his hand resting on his gun butt with casual menace. Isabella's heart sank as she realized the trap had multiple layers. They hadn't just followed her to the mission, they'd anticipated her escape route and cut it off before she could use it. "The count's at 7, Blake said conversationally. "Sister Maria's a brave woman, but bravery stops bullets about as well as prayers do. You want her blood on your hands?" Isabella looked at the mining claim in her hand, then at the mission where a kind woman was about to die for helping a stranger. In that moment, she understood what Samuel had been trying to teach her. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't in running toward justice, but in standing still when running would save your life but cost someone else theirs. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Blake smiled, and in that smile, Isabella saw the death of everything her father had died believing in. Sheriff Blake's smile held all the warmth of a snake sunning itself on a tombstone. "What I want, Miss Martinez, is simple. You hand over that mining claim, walk away, and disappear forever. In return, Sister Maria lives to tend her garden another day." Isabella clutched the leather pouch tighter, feeling the edges of her father's document through the worn hide. "And if I refuse? Then a lot of good people died today for nothing more than a piece of paper." Blake's voice carried the casual indifference of a man who'd watched too many people die to be moved by the prospect of more death. "Your choice." From the mission came the sound of Morrison's count reaching 9, his voice growing sharper with each number. Through the cemetery silence, Isabella could hear Sister Maria's prayer continuing, steady and unafraid, even as death approached her doorstep. 10, Morrison called out, and the word hung in the desert air like a judgment. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her like desert stones. Her father had died for this claim, believing that justice existed somewhere in the world. Samuel had fought impossible odds to give her a chance to find that justice. Sister Maria was about to die defending a stranger's right to truth, and now she had to choose between honoring their sacrifices and saving their lives. "I need to see Sister Maria first," Isabella said quietly, "to know she's alive before I give you anything." Blake considered this, his eyes calculating like a merchant weighing gold. "Fair enough. But any tricks, any attempts to run, and I put a bullet in the old woman's spine. Clear?" They walked back toward the mission together, Isabella's hands empty but her mind racing. As they rounded the corner of the old building, she saw Morrison's men positioned around the entrance, rifles ready, faces hard with the kind of patience that came from knowing the outcome was inevitable. Sister Maria stood in the mission doorway, her weathered hands folded calmly in front of her, her silver hair catching the afternoon light like a crown. She showed no fear, only the serene acceptance of someone who'd made peace with whatever God had planned for her. "Child," Sister Maria said when she saw Isabella, "you came back. I couldn't let you die for my father's fight, and I can't let you surrender his legacy for my old bones." Sister Maria's eyes were fierce with conviction. "Some things are worth dying for, Isabella. Justice is one of them." Morrison stepped forward, his expensive coat dusty from the desert ride, his patience finally exhausted. "Enough sentiment. Give me the document, and we can all go home." Isabella looked around at the circle of armed men, at Morrison's confident smile, at Sheriff Blake's casual cruelty. Then she looked at Sister Maria, who stood ready to die for a principle she'd never wavered from in 60 years of life. "You want the mining claim?" Isabella asked, her voice carrying across the desert air with surprising strength. I want what belongs to the territorial government, Morrison replied carefully. Isabella reached into the leather pouch and withdrew the folded document, holding it up so everyone could see it clearly. This paper proves my father owned his mine legally, that he paid his fees, filed his claims, followed every law you created. Forgeries can be made to prove anything, Morrison said dismissively. Can they? Isabella unfolded the document, revealing not just her father's mining claim, but something else, a second paper that had been hidden within the first. Then I suppose this is a forgery too. She held up a letter bearing the territorial governor's official seal, signed and dated 3 months before her father's death. Morrison's face went white as he recognized the document. A letter promising to investigate corruption in mining claim seizures, specifically mentioning Pedro Martinez as an example of illegal government theft. Where did you get that? Morrison's voice had lost all its cultured smoothness. My father was more careful than you thought. He knew men like you would try to steal what he'd built, so he documented everything. Every bribe you offered, every threat you made, every illegal seizure you orchestrated. Isabella's voice grew stronger with each word. This letter proves the territorial governor himself was investigating your operation. Sheriff Blake's hand moved toward his gun, but Sister Maria stepped forward, placing herself between the weapons and Isabella. Garrett Morrison, Sister Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of the church itself. You and your men are on sacred ground. Whatever sins you've committed, whatever crimes you're planning, remember that God sees all things and his justice is longer than any man's reach. Morrison's laugh was ugly, desperate. God doesn't vote in territorial elections, sister. God doesn't sign mining rights or appoint sheriffs. Men with money and influence do. Then perhaps it's time men with money and influence remembered that they answer to someone higher than themselves. That's when the unexpected happened. From beyond the desert horizon came the sound of approaching horses, not the rough, hurried thunder of outlaws, but the disciplined rhythm of cavalry. Morrison's head snapped toward the sound, his confident expression cracking like paint in the desert sun. Expecting company? Sister Maria asked innocently. The riders who crested the ridge wore the blue uniforms of the Territorial Marshal Service, led by a man whose brass buttons caught the sunlight like golden fire. Marshal John Hawthorne, Isabella realized. The one honest lawman in 300 miles, the man Samuel had told her about during their brief time together. Well, Marshal Hawthorne called out as his men surrounded Morrison's group. This is an interesting tableau. Mind telling me why armed men are threatening a nun on church property? Morrison's mind worked frantically, trying to salvage something from the collapsing situation. Marshal, we're apprehending a dangerous fugitive who stole government documents. Is that so? Hawthorne dismounted, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene, with the practiced attention of a man who'd learned to read truth in the way people held themselves. And what documents might those be? Isabella stepped forward, the leather pouch clutched in her hands like a shield. Documents proving my father's legal ownership of a silver mine that was seized illegally by territorial officials. She handed the papers to Marshal Hawthorne, watching his weathered face as he read both the mining claim and the governor's letter. His expression grew grimmer with each line, until finally he looked up at Morrison with eyes like winter ice. Garrett Morrison, Hawthorne said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of Pedro Martinez. Morrison's face twisted with rage and desperation. You can't prove murder. Pedro Martinez died in a mining accident. Actually, a new voice said from behind the marshal's men, I can prove it. Isabella's heart nearly stopped as Samuel Westbrook rode into view, his clothes torn and bloody, but his eyes alive with grim satisfaction. Behind him rode two more men she didn't recognize, territorial investigators by the look of their badges. Samuel, Isabella breathed, hardly daring to believe he'd survived the battle at his ranch. Takes more than Morrison's hired guns to kill an old soldier, Samuel said, dismounting stiffly, especially when that soldier's been expecting this fight for 20 years. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small leather-bound book. Morrison made one mistake when he ordered Pedro Martinez killed. He kept records of all his illegal activities, thinking they'd protect him if anyone ever investigated. His bookkeeper was keeping a second set of books, documenting every bribe, Every murder, every stolen claim. That's impossible, Morrison snarled. Thomas burned those records when he died. Thomas didn't die, Samuel said quietly. He just got very tired of working for a man who killed innocent people for money. He's been hiding on my ranch for 3 years, waiting for someone honest enough to listen to his story. The trap was complete. Morrison and his men were surrounded by federal marshals, their crimes documented by their own records, their victim's daughter holding proof of their corruption. But Isabella felt no triumph, only the exhaustion that comes when justice arrives too late to save the people you love. "Will this bring my father back?" she asked Marshal Hawthorne. "No, Miss Martinez, but it will make sure no other fathers die for Garrett Morrison's greed." Sister Maria placed a gentle hand on Isabella's shoulder. "Sometimes, child, justice isn't about healing the past. Sometimes it's about protecting the future." As Morrison and his men were led away in chains, Isabella stood in the mission cemetery, surrounded by people who'd risked everything to help a stranger find truth. Samuel, who'd lost his peaceful retirement to fight for what was right. Sister Maria, who'd faced death rather than compromise her principles. Marshal Hawthorne, who'd ridden across 3 territories to investigate corruption. "What happens now?" Isabella asked Samuel as the sun began to set over the desert. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build with the freedom your father died to give you," Samuel replied, his weathered hand gentle on her arm. "The mine is yours, legally and officially. You can work it, sell it, or just let it stand as a monument to an honest man's dream." Isabella looked at the mining claim in her hands, then at the people who'd helped her carry it to safety. For the first time since her father's death, the future looked like something worth building, rather than something to run from. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to build something new. Something my father would be proud of." And in that moment, as the desert stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella Martinez stopped running and started building. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in refusing to let them destroy your capacity for hope. 3 months later, the desert had transformed from a place of terror into something approaching home. Isabella stood at the entrance to her father's mine, watching the first crew of honest workers she'd ever hired emerge from the tunnels, their faces tired but satisfied with a day's honest labor. The silver they'd extracted would be sold at fair market prices, and every man would receive his agreed-upon wage without the threats and intimidation that had marked the Morrison era. The mine itself had been restored to working condition with surprising speed once word spread that the new owner paid fair wages and treated her workers with dignity. Men came from 3 territories seeking employment, drawn not just by the promise of steady work, but by the story of how Pedro Martinez's daughter had fought the territorial government and won. Samuel leaned against the mine office doorway, his shoulders still stiff from the bullet wound he'd taken during the battle at his ranch, but his eyes bright with something Isabella had never seen there before. Contentment. He'd sold his damaged ranch to a young family from back east and invested the proceeds in Isabella's mining operation, becoming her partner in both business and, increasingly, in life. "Production's up 30% from what Morrison was pulling out," Samuel reported, consulting the ledger books they kept meticulously clean and honest. "Course, we're paying our workers 3 times what he did, but we're still turning a healthy profit." Isabella smiled, wiping dust from her hands on the practical work clothes she'd adopted. Gone were the torn dresses and desperate flight across the desert. In their place were sturdy boots, denim pants, and cotton shirts that could withstand the demands of running a mining operation. But more than her clothes had changed, she carried herself differently now, with the confidence of a woman who'd faced the worst the world could offer and survived. "Any word from Marshal Hawthorne about Morrison's trial?" she asked. Samuel's expression grew grimmer. "Trial ended yesterday. Morrison got 20 years in territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy. His brother Jake got 10 years as an accessory. Sheriff Blake." Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sheriff Blake didn't live to see trial. Tried to escape federal custody and got himself shot in the process." Isabella felt no satisfaction at the news, only the hollow sadness that came from watching evil destroy itself. "And the other officials involved in the conspiracy?" "Most of them are facing federal charges. The territorial governor himself is under investigation." Samuel closed the ledger and looked out across the desert toward the distant mountains. "Change comes slow to places like this." But it does come. They walked together toward the small cabin Isabella had built near the mine entrance, a modest structure that bore no resemblance to the grand houses Morrison had constructed with his stolen wealth. But it was honest shelter, built with honest money, and it felt more like home than anywhere Isabella had lived since childhood. Inside, Sister Maria sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading from a well-worn Bible. The nun had become a regular visitor, riding out from the mission twice a week to check on Isabella's spiritual well-being and to ensure that success wasn't corrupting the young woman's character the way it had destroyed so many others. "Evening, sister," Samuel said, hanging his hat on a wooden peg by the door. "How are things at the mission?" "Peaceful, thank the Lord, though we've had some interesting visitors lately." Sister Maria's eyes twinkled with barely contained amusement. "Seems Isabella's story has attracted attention from some unexpected quarters." Isabella poured herself coffee from the pot that always sat warming on the stove. "What kind of attention?" "The kind that wears expensive suits and talks about investment opportunities." Sister Maria's tone suggested this wasn't entirely good news. Eastern businessmen who've heard about a woman successfully running a silver mine and want to make her rich beyond her wildest dreams. Samuel's jaw tightened. In exchange for controlling interest in the operation, no doubt. Naturally, they speak of efficiency and modern methods and the benefits of large-scale extraction. Sister Maria set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "They sound remarkably like Garrett Morrison, only with better manners and more expensive clothes." Isabella sank into a chair, suddenly feeling the weight of battles she'd thought were over. Will it never end? Will there always be men trying to take what others have built? "Probably," Samuel said honestly. "But there's a difference between you and your father, Isabella. You've got allies now, you've got resources, and you've got the legal right to tell those Eastern gentlemen exactly where they can put their investment opportunities." Sister Maria laughed, a sound like silver bells in the desert wind. "Samuel Westbrook, your language is becoming decidedly unchristian." "My apologies, sister, but sometimes unchristian language is exactly what the situation calls for." As the evening deepened, they sat around the table sharing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and fresh vegetables from Sister Maria's mission garden. The conversation turned to lighter matters: the weather, the success of the newest mining techniques, plans for expanding the operation in ways that would benefit the entire territory. But Isabella's mind kept returning to the Eastern investors and what they represented. Not just greed, but the endless cycle of people trying to take what others had earned through blood and sacrifice. How many times would she have to fight the same battle? How many Garrett Morrisons would she face before she could simply live in peace? After Sister Maria returned to the mission and Samuel retired to his own small cabin nearby, Isabella sat alone on her porch, watching stars appear in the vast desert sky. The night was warm and still, filled with the gentle sounds of a world at peace: nightbirds calling, the distant sound of water trickling through irrigation channels, the soft rustle of wind through the sagebrush. She was still sitting there when Samuel emerged from his cabin, unable to sleep, and joined her on the porch steps. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly. "Just wondering if we'll ever really be free of men like Morrison," Isabella replied. "If there will ever come a day when I can run this mine without looking over my shoulder for the next threat." Samuel considered this, his weathered face thoughtful in the starlight. "You know, I've been thinking about that myself, and I believe the answer isn't in avoiding threats. It's in building something strong enough to withstand them." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we don't just run a mine. We build a community. We hire local workers, support local businesses, make ourselves too valuable to the territory for corrupt officials to attack easily." Samuel's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theme. "We make this operation about more than just silver. We make it about proving that honest business can succeed without corruption." Isabella felt something stir in her chest, a familiar feeling she'd first experienced when her father used to talk about his dreams for the mine. Hope, she realized, not just for survival, but for something better. "You're talking about more than a mining operation," she said slowly. "I'm talking about a legacy. Something that would make your father proud and give other honest people a chance to build something good in this territory." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Isabella spoke, her voice carrying a new note of determination. Samuel, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something I've been too afraid to say out loud. He turned to look at her, his expression patient and encouraging. That day at your ranch, when I whispered, "Be gentle, it's too fast," I wasn't just talking about being afraid of physical touch. I was afraid of trusting anyone, of letting anyone close enough to hurt me the way my father's death had hurt me. Samuel nodded, understanding. And now? Isabella took his weathered hand in hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. Now I think I'm ready to stop being afraid, ready to build something with someone I trust. Samuel's smile was gentle, patient, like everything else about him. Are you sure? Because once we start building something together, there's no going back to the way things were. I'm sure. Isabella's voice was steady, filled with the quiet confidence of a woman who'd faced her fears and found them manageable. I want to build something that will outlast both of us. Something that proves good people can win if they're willing to fight for what's right. Samuel stood and extended his hand to help her up. Then I suppose we'd better get started. As they walked toward the house together, Isabella felt a sense of completion she'd never experienced before. Not the end of struggle. There would always be new challenges, new Garrett Morrisons to face down. But the beginning of something worth fighting for, something worth building, something worth the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. The desert around them was vast and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful in its own harsh way. Like justice, Isabella thought, hard to achieve, painful to fight for, but beautiful when you finally held it in your hands. Behind them, the mine entrance stood dark and silent, but it no longer looked like a wound in the earth. It looked like what it was, the foundation of a dream that had survived murder, corruption, and the worst that greed could devise. A dream that would continue growing, one honest day's work at a time. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, watching over a territory, slowly learning that justice was possible, that good people could win, and that sometimes the gentlest victories were the ones that lasted longest. In her heart, Isabella carried her father's memory and his belief that honest work deserved honest reward. In her hands, she carried the tools to make that belief reality. And beside her walked a man who'd chosen to fight for a stranger's justice and found something worth living for in the process. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of rain that might actually come this time, washing the last traces of blood from the sand and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next in this hard but fertile soil. Isabella Martinez had stopped running. Now she was building, and what she built would stand long after the men who'd tried to destroy her were nothing but dust and forgotten names in territorial records. Because that's what victory really meant in the American West. Not the moment when the shooting stopped, but the years that followed, when ordinary people proved that extraordinary courage could create something lasting and good in a world that often seemed determined to crush both dreams and dreamers. The future stretched ahead like an uncharted territory, full of possibilities and challenges. But Isabella faced it with eyes clear and hands steady, carrying the tools she'd need to build whatever came next. And that, perhaps, was the real miracle. Not that she'd survived the desert, but that the desert had taught her how to thrive. And that, friends, is how Isabella Martinez learned that sometimes the most powerful words you can speak aren't demands or threats, but a simple plea for gentleness in a world that's forgotten how to be kind. When she whispered, "Be gentle, it's too fast," to Samuel Westbrook that scorching desert day, she wasn't just asking him to treat her wounds carefully. She was asking him to understand that her soul had been broken by too much cruelty, too much betrayal, too much loss happening too quickly for any heart to bear. Samuel heard more than her words that day. He heard the cry of every person who'd ever been pushed beyond their limits, who'd been forced to run when they wanted to rest, who'd been hurt when they desperately needed healing. And his response, stepping back, giving her space, offering water without demanding gratitude, became the foundation for something neither of them expected. A love built not on passion or desperation, but on the radical act of treating another human being with dignity when they had no power to demand it. This isn't just a story about the Old West, though it's set in that harsh and beautiful landscape. It's a story about what happens when we choose to see the wounded person behind the defensive walls, when we decide that someone else's healing matters more than our own convenience. Isabella's journey from terrified fugitive to confident mine owner didn't happen because she found her strength. It happened because someone gave her the time and space to remember the strength she'd always carried. Samuel's transformation was just as profound. He went from a bitter hermit nursing old wounds to a man who discovered that the cure for his own pain was helping someone else heal from theirs. When he chose to fight for Isabella's father's justice, he wasn't just standing up for what was right. He was reclaiming his own belief that good people could make a difference in a world that often seemed determined to crush hope. Maybe that's the real lesson hidden in this desert tale. In our own lives, we all carry wounds that make us want to run, fears that make us whisper, "Be gentle, it's too fast," to a world that rarely slows down for anyone's pain. We've all been Isabella at some point, desperate, alone, afraid to trust the kindness of strangers because cruelty has taught us that kindness always comes with a price. And we've all had the chance to be Samuel, to encounter someone whose defenses are up, whose trust has been shattered, whose heart needs time to heal. In those moments, we get to choose. Do we demand immediate gratitude? Do we push for connection on our timeline rather than theirs? Or do we step back, offer what help we can without conditions, and give wounded souls the greatest gift possible, the time and space to heal at their own pace? The corruption that Isabella fought wasn't just about stolen mining claims or territorial politics. It was about a system that treated people as commodities, that measured worth in dollars rather than dignity, that saw vulnerability as weakness to be exploited rather than humanity to be protected. When she and Samuel built their honest mining operation, they weren't just creating a business. They were proving that success didn't require stepping on others, that strength could be gentle, that power could be used to lift people up rather than tear them down. Sister Maria understood this truth from the beginning. Her willingness to risk everything for a stranger wasn't about religion or politics. It was about the fundamental belief that every person deserves to be treated with kindness, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. She saw Isabella not as a problem to be solved or a cause to be championed, but as a human being worthy of protection simply because she was human. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of times when someone showed you unexpected kindness or when you had the chance to be gentle with someone who needed it, don't let that feeling fade away like desert wind. Think about the people in your own life who might be running from something, who might need someone to slow down and offer patience instead of pressure. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that remind us of our better angels. Share this tale with someone who might need to hear about the power of gentleness in a harsh world. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you tales from the frontier that prove the most important battles aren't always fought with guns. Sometimes they're won with understanding, with patience, with the revolutionary act of treating broken people like they're worth healing. Leave a comment below and tell us about a time someone was gentle with you when you needed it most, or when you had the chance to offer that gift to someone else. Because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders of who we can be when we choose compassion over convenience, understanding over judgment. The American frontier was built by people who understood that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant staying human in the face of impossible odds. Isabella and Samuel's love story reminds us that the greatest frontier we can explore isn't geographic, but emotional. The courage to be vulnerable with each other, to build trust slowly and carefully, to create something lasting and good in a world that often seems determined to tear everything down. Until our trails cross again, remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is whisper, "Be gentle," to a world that's forgotten how to slow down, and then become the answer to your own prayer by offering that gentleness to others. This has been Wild West Stories, where every tale proves that the human heart is the wildest frontier of all,